Welcome to this very special Menzies Research Centre event, streaming live from here in Melbourne on the ADH TV network, which you can watch on the ADH TV app or on the web, adh.tv. It's a very special evening for us here at the Menzies Research Centre. We're celebrating a remarkable achievement. A remarkable achievement indeed. We're here to mark the completion of the most authoritative history of European settlement in Australia ever published, and I say that without qualification. 235 years of the most extraordinary period and episode in human history, recorded in five fine volumes, authoritative, compelling reading, intellectually profound and comprehensive. No work like this has ever been written, possibly to the shame of previous historians, but here we have it, the completion of these 5 volumes today. First, let me ask you to honour the author of this magnificent work, which has told the story of Australia as we should have been told it in schools. Will you please join with me in honouring Dr. David Kemp? The 5 volumes in total form the history of a free nation, a nation on one of only 2 continents in the entire world which has never hosted a civil war, the other being, of course, Antarctica. It's a story of a nation that grew from a convict settlement, initially of around 1,000 people, into one of the most successful countries on earth. In fact, some would say the most successful, the freest, the best country in the world. I would certainly say that. It is a country which now has more Australian or US dollar millionaires per capita than any other country except Luxembourg and Switzerland, and they're cheating. We have genuine people who've grown wealthy here, have grown happy and rich because of the freedom which we enjoy. And I can think of no person better qualified to launch this, the 5th volume, the final volume of David's magnificent work, than our second special guest. Lord Hannan, Baron Hannan of Kingsclere, Daniel to his friends, is a writer, a thinker, and one of the most serious commentators on conservative politics, and a historian. He represented South East England as a Conservative Euro MP from 1999 until 2020, when he achieved his crowning achievement, which was to abolish his own job as a proud Brexiteer. Welcome, Daniel. I first met Dan in 2013, I think it was, when he was here to launch his magnificent book, Inventing Freedom: How the English-Speaking People Made the Modern World. That book got me seriously thinking about the good judgment of Australians in choosing their colonising power. They could have made the mistake, like some, of choosing the French or the Portuguese or, God forbid, the Belgians. But instead we inherited a remarkable tradition, a remarkable form of liberty that took seed in a very unlikely, dark, gloomy island off the northwest coast of continental Europe and nowhere else. And as Australia was settled in 1788, that tradition of liberty was being given concrete form through the thinking of the Enlightenment, through Adam Smith, through Burke, and later John Stuart Mill. And as Daniel wrote in his book, Australia was John Stuart Mill's vision of freedom made flesh. Daniel, although he's obviously not an Australian, we hope he will become one day, Daniel, anybody can, is a great admirer of this country, but also a great student of history. His book is, if you like, could be described as the prelude to David's magnificent work. Will you join me, please, in welcoming to the podium Daniel Hannan.
Well, Nick, thank you for your kind words, and thank you for sponsoring this magnificent, this magnum opus of David's. It's an absolutely defining work that contains everything that needs saying, and that will stand like Macaulay's History of England or like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and will be read decades, even centuries from now, as the last word on Australian liberalism. So it's a very nice thing to have come all this way to say that, and thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. While I'm on my feet, let me just say this. First of all, buy the book. It will repay the investment in terms of pleasure and interest. But you may be wondering why I've come from the UK to launch a book about Australian liberalism. Well, it's an interesting thing. The Economist magazine occasionally publishes league tables about how much countries like each other. They're asked to rank which countries they approve of. And do they approve of Israel or the US or China or whatever? Now, unsurprisingly, almost every country puts itself at the top of its own list. So almost every country approves of itself to the tune of, approval ratings in the high 90s. The one exception being the UK, which puts itself third, a whisker behind Australia and New Zealand, and actually just ahead of Canada. And in a strange way, rather as Nick was suggesting, the settler colonies, if you like, are a kind of projection to us of our best selves. It's how we imagine life would be in a more Platonic form. So here are countries that share the trappings and institutions with us, the monarchy, the parliamentary system, the rule of law, the same sense of humour, the same sport, the same indignation at injustice, the same readiness to stand up to bullies and tyrants. But somehow in a roomier and more capacious, more classless, more outdoorsy way, and more wealthy way. Right? Without disparaging the cheating Luxembourgers and Swiss, there is a reason why the flow of population from the UK to Australia has been so much greater than in the opposite direction. There are many more Nick Caters than there are Clive Jameses, so to speak. And the reason for that is, if you like, the obvious one, right? If you come from Adlington to Adelaide, doing the same job with the same qualifications, you can reasonably expect a bigger house and a shorter commute, and obviously more sunshine. So the question is why? Why is it true that a country founded later with less infrastructure, a lot of which is arid and difficult to settle, why did it become so much richer? Why is its GDP per head higher? Well, on one level, that's a silly question. It's an easy question to answer. Australia became rich for the same reason that all countries become rich, which is it pursued the right policies. Low tax, low spending, free trade, secure property rights, free contract, etc. Right? Same formula that works everywhere. Okay, that bit's easy. But let's delve a little bit deeper and ask, why did it do those things? What were the cultural factors or political factors that drove successive Australian governments of different parties broadly to make the right decisions? This, of course, is what the 5th volume of David's book sets out to explain, and I think explains very convincingly. I suppose I ought to say, because I know what it's like when you speak to a conservative audience, there will be people thinking, Struth, mate, if only you knew the truth of this place. No. This is an extremely lucky country, and believe me when I tell you that most of the world would gladly swap their problems for yours. David begins this book with a series of league tables, UN measures and so on, that measure not just wealth, not just GDP per capita, but contentment, quality of healthcare, quality of environment and so on. Australia is at or near the top of almost all of them. There is a reason why the in queue is so much longer than the out queue. There is a reason why people are prepared to take risks to try and come here, or indeed are prepared at the very least to give up friends and family and familiarity to start a new life here. So what were the factors that led to the freedom and prosperity that we can very easily take for granted, but that actually in the world are still pretty exceptional? Well, look, when you set out to answer a question that big, it's never a single simple answer. Right? But let me draw together, on the basis of David's book, what I think are some of the key contributing factors. First of all, the point that Nick just suggested. There's a nice phrase that Tocqueville uses, Alexis de Tocqueville, in his Democracy in America, where he says, the American is the Englishman left to himself. Tocqueville is obsessed with what he calls the point de départ, the point of origin of different cultures. And he has this theory that in the New World, they become exaggerated. They become, if you like, truer forms of themselves. So as he saw it, just as Spanish America replicated and exaggerated the kind of ramshackle corruption of Philip's Spain, and just as French America exaggerated the obscurantism and seigneurialism of Bourbon France, so English America, as he always called it, exaggerated the libertarianism, the republicanism, the localism that was given a freer rein in the New World than in the Old. And I think plainly you can see something of that kind playing out in Australia. There was an abundance of land, there was no native aristocracy, there was an enterprising culture almost from the off. I say almost from the off because, of course, if you go right the way back to volume 1 of this great series, there was this rather crazy attempt to fund the first penal colonies with state-run farms, which obviously, well, you all know how that was going to end, right? It's the same way that collectives always end. But as soon as the decision was made to trust to the natural enterprise and industriousness of people, even ex-convicts, as soon as they were given grants of land, you saw the beginning of a property-based and liberal system. It turned out that they were great entrepreneurs as well as being great, so to speak, preneurs, these early prisoners. And then, of course, that becomes self-fulfilling. People start choosing to come because they're attracted by the culture that has been created. So that's one factor, if you like, the geographical explanation. I think a big and underrated part of the explanation is that the UK diverged from the old dominions by being more exposed to the Second World War and the expansion of state power necessitated by mobilization. The dial never quite moved back to where it had been before 1940. Even in the most obvious sense, we had food rationing until 1954, we had identity cards until 1952, we had full conscription until 1960. But when you look at the economics, the exchange controls and so on, they were there until the Thatcher government. Now here it was a very different story, because instead of Clement Attlee, you had Robert Menzies, and there was a determination to return to normal. I just want you to bear that in mind, by the way, when we think about returning to normal after COVID, because there are, again, we see the same pattern, that the state is very reluctant to give back freedoms that it seized on a supposedly contingent basis to deal with an emergency. There was a big lockdown in Victoria. Who knew? Who knew? Right. Well, make sure that it's put to bed properly and it's forgotten, and that these things are not allowed to linger. And then now this is. Okay, I got some murmurs of approval for the last one. I'm now, this is quite a high window to be thrown out of, but I'm going to say this anyway. And I think it's difficult not to conclude this after reading David's book. Australia has been relatively fortunate in the temper of its chief left-of-centre party. You don't have to look too far around the democratic world to find radical and bloodthirsty parties of the left that were determined to pull things down, that said that the revolution would be complete only when the last priest had been strangled with the bowels of the last king. Well, that was never the way, either here or in the rest of the Anglosphere. Our Labour parties, and they were Labour parties in pretty much all of the settler colonies, they were, their roots were in brass bands and working men's libraries, and they were much more interested in lifting people up than in tearing them down. And it is perhaps telling that on most measures, this Labour government in Australia is pursuing policies that are to the right, at least on tax and spend, of a Conservative government in the UK that has had 13 years in office. Right? If you like, the parameters of the debate are in a good place here. The centre of gravity is in a more favourable position than in a number of other countries. Again, I repeat my imprecation that you bear in mind what I'm saying is relative, right? Relative to other countries. It's the most easy thing. It's natural and it's human to say, but this or that is going wrong, but this or that is flawed. Yep, absolutely. Perfection is not for this life. But most countries would swap their problems for yours. And then let me say what I think is the single biggest factor, though. It's the people. Australia has been peopled by unusually industrious and enterprising settlers, first as a function of distance and then as deliberate policy. It's even now, recall what is involved in migration. It's a big deal to say that you're not going to see your friends and family, except perhaps rarely and intermittently ever again. To cross half the world and start a life somewhere else. That is difficult even now, in an age when you can watch satellite TV from home, when there's jet travel, when there's internet connections. Imagine what it was like when the journey here could take 4 months, when it really meant that you were not going to see anybody again. There is, I put it to you, an optimism bias intrinsic in that migration. It is bound to appeal to people who are more enterprising and entrepreneurial than the mean. It can't fail to. Right? And that, again, tended to move where the political centre of gravity was, to shift it in a pro-property and pro-enterprise direction. And that then became policy. Now, David, I think in your summary, you talk about 1973 as being the year that immigration policy changes. But actually, if you look at the detail, I think you're saying that is not giving enough credit to the previous Liberal government. There was a decision made that there was opportunity to take the best and brightest from around the world, and it eventually took form in the points-based migration system that is the envy of other countries. Right? So whether people have come here from Malaysia or the Philippines or China or India, an immigration system that, if you like, encourages people to fight off competition for each space, not only guarantees a certain quality among new arrivals, but also guarantees that they will arrive patriotic, grateful, and happy to be here. Right? A very, very different way from some of the European migration systems, which were either based on taking people en masse, paying their fares, and putting them to work for the government, which unsurprisingly makes them unlikely to be Tory voters, or simply acknowledging that if they've managed to cheat the system long enough and stay in the country undetected for long enough to acquire the right to remain, that they will get citizenship. That is, if you like, a system that might have been designed to encourage contempt for the rules rather than gratitude or patriotism. Australia fundamentally is rich because of the calibre of Australians. It's important to add that an ambitious policy of controlled legal migration depends on public support and therefore confidence that the system isn't being abused. I don't think that Australia could have managed the ambitious points-based immigration system it had without the flip side, as John Howard put it, that we decide who comes here and in what circumstances they come. John Howard, by the way, gets a deserved chunk of praise in this book, but it was taken further and made the same point made even more pithily by Tony Abbott in the phrase "stop the boats." Right? It's basically the same point. And I think Tony, perhaps, if I had one criticism, Tony, I would have been a bit more generous too in this book. Not only as a liberal who, opened up trade deals and ended the subsidies with Qantas and so on, but also as the guy who facilitated the following liberal governments. Right? Without his majority, it wouldn't have happened. But that control that makes it impossible for people to cheat, or very, very difficult for people to cheat the system and elbow their way to the front of the queue, allows for a measure of consent around bringing people here legally so that they can contribute to the common weal. All of this depends on what I think is the single biggest factor of all, which is the importance of citizenship as your primary political identity. Nick and I were talking about a book by Victor Davis Hanson about the dwindling of the importance of citizenship as your chief identity and its displacement by other identities because you're Presbyterian or Indian or whatever it is, right? A modern multiracial society depends on a shared sense of equal citizenship. I don't want to presume to intrude into your domestic debates, but allow my relative kinship and my fondness for Australian democracy to say that whatever these debates are about voices to Parliament and so on, they must accept that everyone is equal before the law and that all Australian citizens have the same freedoms and the same rights. Now, that is a concept that is coming under fire, not just in Australia, but the world over. And in a way, the wonder is that it's lasted as long as it has, because we are tribal creatures by nature. We evolved in kin groups. The oldest ethic of human behavior is my tribe good, your tribe bad. That's an ethic that would have been well understood by the settlers, by the pre-settlement population here, as by our own ancestors in hunter-gatherer days, right? In evolutionary terms, we're still living on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. The idea that all of us are autonomous individuals does not come naturally, needs to be taught, needs to be inculcated. We need an education system that preserves Enlightenment values, because otherwise people will devolve into tribalism. The great German-American historian Hannah Arendt had a nice phrase. She said, "Every generation the West is invaded by barbarians, we call them children." In other words, we all came into the world with the same mental apparatus that we would have done 10,000 years ago. The reason we don't live the way we did 10,000 years ago is because of accumulated knowledge that allows us to understand a number of counterintuitive ideas. The idea, for example, that someone you don't like might still have useful things to say. Right? It's a difficult idea, as anyone who spent 10 minutes on social media can confirm. The idea that instead of there being some truth that is there to be revealed by some elite sacerdotal class, that the truth can be temporary and contingent, that you can reach it by experimentation, and that when some better theory comes along, you can discard the old one. Right? The scientific method, all of this is alien to human nature. All of it needs to be taught, and that is the primary function of our education system. Which, of course, leads me to the thing that worries me most, not only about Australia, but about the Western world more widely. That not only our universities, but our secondary schools, the places that should be temples of the Enlightenment, instead of teaching the difficult and counter-cyclical truth that we are all individuals and are not defined by ancestry or physiognomy, are instead teaching the pro-cyclical truth and encouraging their students in the belief that the single most important thing about them is that they're female or white or whatever it is. And no open society can sustain that degree of tribalism. If we don't all believe that we're citizens equal before the law, then very quickly a democracy breaks down. As the great American economist Thomas Sowell once put it, you can't sustain an open society on the basis that two babies born on the same day arrive in this world with a set of pre-existing grievances. Right? When you put it like that, it is very hard to disagree. So let me finish in introducing David by issuing a cry for you to recall what is recorded here and to act on it. Remember who you are. I never come to Melbourne without going to your Shrine of Remembrance. I'm sure that it's such a familiar landmark to some of you that you walk past it and no longer particularly register its presence. But believe me when I tell you that no visitor from the UK can do that. It's the thought of all those young men crossing half the world to fight for a country that in many cases they'd never set eyes on is something that moves me as much now as when I first visited this state. And I'm always struck by the hard, pithy, lapidary inscription there, "This is holy ground," right? Which ends with the fantastic sentiment, "Ye therefore that come after give remembrance." I think part of being an Australian means communicating to your children that whether their grandparents were from Ukraine or Greece or Korea or Vietnam, they are now heirs to a sublime patrimony as Australians. That they are not just a random set of individuals born to a different random set of individuals, but that they are inheritors of this tradition of freedom, and that inheriting it from their parents imposes upon them, imposes on every Australian, the duty to hand it on intact to the next generation. Ye, therefore, that come after, give remembrance. Ladies and gentlemen, David Kemp.
Daniel, thank you very much for that introduction of the book and for making this long journey to launch it. That's a slight distortion, as we both know, that you're here for a number of activities, and we will be joined, in fact, in one tomorrow. But I know that Nick Cater was particularly keen to bring you here to this particular event, and I am deeply grateful to Nick, of course, for his enormous support for these volumes right from the start. In fact, it's true to say that without Nick's support, they wouldn't have been published. It took a publisher, of course, to agree to publish them, but it took someone to say, well, we will sponsor these books. And Nick did that, and he organised to assist in the financing of the earlier volumes, and I'm deeply grateful to the Menzies Research Centre for having done that. I'm pleased to say that the final volume, published by the same company, the Melbourne University Publishing, under their Maya Gunya imprint, is a commercial proposition on their part. And that is quite a compliment, I think, to the support that the earlier books have had from the general public. That there's enough interest in the earlier books to make the final book one that is likely to stand on its own feet without any particular sponsorship. But Nick again has said, well, you know, we'll continue to associate ourselves with this final volume, and so thank you very much, Nick. Daniel, thank you again for accepting Nick's persuasive invitation to come and launch this volume. You're certainly a hero of mine in terms of your extraordinary political career in the European Parliament and the United Kingdom. I think identity felt too strongly and defended too strongly as perhaps an enemy of liberalism, but nevertheless I was pleased to hear you were a Scot. Because the Scots, of course, brought the Enlightenment to England. And the Scottish Enlightenment was an absolutely key aspect to the foundation of Australia. It's true, Adam Smith was a Scot. And the ideas of that Enlightenment were absolutely critical, I think, in giving a certain moral basis and united support to its establishment in Australia. Macquarie was a Scot, and of course a close friend of the son of the person who was Robert Burns' main sponsor. So pleased to see that. It occurred to me the odd thought that on coming in on the tram that had you been born in Australia, you would have been a senator. The upper house in Britain would have paralleled very nicely the upper house here, and because this first set of remarks will acknowledge people, I must acknowledge my former parliamentary colleagues who are here, several of whom are senators: Richard Alston, my brother Rod Kemp, and James Patterson. And also I acknowledge the presence of Stuart MacArthur, who was one of the great backbench Liberals in the Parliament during his time there as head of a group established by, well, in memory of, I suppose, Bill O'Kelly, who was the man who supported free trade and brought free trade to Australia. As even Whitlam acknowledged, his defence of the free trade idea really led Australia to move, or helped Australia to move down that path. So welcome here and thank you for coming. I'd like to perhaps build on the remarks rather than repeat some of the things that have been said by Daniel. But his presence here does remind us of one tremendously important issue that Australia has faced, its politics have faced, that its leaders have faced, because he was one of the outstanding leaders of Brexit in Britain. And one of the great issues that any liberal country faces is the relationship between its liberal ideals of individual dignity and freedom of trade and the rule of law, and the links that those values have with democracy. And one of the things that struck me very much during that whole debate about democracy and Brexit was how few were the voices in Britain who actually articulated the view that Britain was a crippled democracy when so much of its sovereign right was exercised by the undemocratic EU. And one of the astonishing things about that debate, to which Daniel was an exception, was how few of the leaders of Britain seemed to care at all about democracy and the need to restore Britain's sovereignty, to confront Britain's problems without having them dealt with by people in Europe on whom Britain had only very limited influence. And that, of course, has been the great element in the Australian Liberal project. Australia is a country that deeply values democracy from the very start. It's always held authority in suspicion, even when that authority was liberal, as in many ways the authority of someone like Arthur Phillip was, or as some of the early governors were. Governor Richard Burke in New South Wales, liberal men, absolutely leaders of their time. But democracy needed to be added to that to make sure that the power that they had, unaccountable in those early days, became accountable to the people who had come here and who quickly saw themselves as Australians. And so the democratic institutions that this country had, it acquired decades before the United Kingdom, and to some extent many states in the United States acquired universal male suffrage. It acquired female suffrage in Australia decades before Great Britain or the United States. And that's led me to say in Volume 5 that in many ways Australia is the most liberal country in the world, because you cannot ultimately disentangle liberalism and democracy, because without democracy, the government that seeks to be liberal, the most liberal government of all, and no one doubted the European governments tried to be liberal, but their decisions were made and their power was exercised by people who were never accountable to a European people. They tried to invent a European people. There is such a thing, I think, as European citizenship now, but there is no government of Europe that's accountable. So Australia sailed as the great enlightenment experiment in the world, arguably the greatest offshoot of the Enlightenment in practical political terms, as a democratic country, exemplifying democracy to the world. And that meant that its governments from the very start were, in a very important sense, and it's often diminished these days in political rhetoric, but in an absolutely vital sense, accountable to the people who elected and dismissed members of Parliament and governments. Now, it's worth dwelling on that point because Volume 5 is very much about how Australian democracy has worked over the last half-century and asked the question, how liberal has it been? Daniel used a wonderful question and said, how are we going to remember who we are in Australia if we don't know our history? And that's why I've occupied myself part-time over the last 12 years in writing these volumes. They're not autobiographical at all, even this latest volume, although that's the period of my political activity in Australia. But they're an attempt to remember and give people memories of what's happened here, what have been the guiding ideas, what they implied, how they've affected our institutions, and how we can make those institutions work to be more liberal than we are now. So in a sense, I hope that they will fulfil the role that Daniel mentioned for them, which is to be a national memory. And they were written because I didn't believe that that memory existed. That so much of Australian history either deals with very brief periods or is written from a point of view which, well, perhaps partly liberal, ignores an enormous amount of what has happened in this country in terms of its liberal history in the 19th century, the establishment of the economy based on private enterprise, and the evolution of a free market Australia, which became by the year 2000 something of a miracle economy, as it was often called, in the OECD. That story deserved to be told. And each of these volumes successively goes through that story from the 26th of January 1788 up to the last federal election. I waited to finish the last pages of the final volume to see what the outcome of that election was. And of course nervously read the last chapter now, which is certainly not history in a professional sense, but is, I think, deeply within the framework that the book puts forward. And there's more to be said about the Morrison government, and I want to make some current comments. But let me finish on this vital question, which is very relevant to politicians today, and it was relevant to me as a Member of Parliament, the relationship between being a democracy and trying to be liberal. Because, as we know, Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others that have been tried. And the problem with democracy is that democracy empowers self-interest. It encourages people to say what's worrying them and asking politicians to solve them. And by encouraging self-interest, that's often selfish. And much of politics is actually about politicians trying to deal with selfish demands. And of course, politicians themselves can be selfish. They're full of self-interest. And the whole system evolves under the pressure of the self-interest of politicians. So how do you realise ideals and make a country more liberal when you're dealing with these enormous political pressures year after year? And in Volume 5, I've tried to show the pressures on the political leaders. And I've shown very often those pressures have led to illiberal consequences, as well as liberal. But because of the country's foundation and the ideals that have come down to us, and what people in Australia take for granted that other countries don't take for granted, even when politicians don't know a lot about liberalism and the ideas behind it and any level of sophistication, and certainly without historical experience, they nevertheless intuitively move towards liberal language and liberal ideas. And I'm bound to make reference to the current Treasurer's article in the Monthly on this. I sat at my desk this morning and did a word count. What ideas were in that Monthly article and what ideas were not? Well, the individual as a noun never occurs. Human dignity as nouns never occur. Flexibility, choice, they don't occur. The words that occur are crisis. But one word that keeps coming back, which is very different, is like Kevin Rudd, but not very like Whitlam, is market. But these are markets of a special kind. They're markets designed by government. The word democracy is there, but the word democracy in the article does mean legitimate government. It doesn't mean government responding to the people or accountable to the people. And the markets are markets designed by governments, not markets designed to respond to the values of the people, to the values of entrepreneurs, to the values of consumers. And so it's the vain search, once again, that we see from, and this is going to sound very partisan, but I think in this audience you might allow me to get away with it. It homes to the very point that Labor believes there's a third way. There ultimately is no third way. There's democracy on one hand and autocracy on the other. There's freedom and power, liberty and power. And the great political arguments are always how to balance those two. And trying to make policy without an awareness of the whole enlightenment foundation of Australian politics, which is set out in these books, is to use a language which is absolutely poverty-stricken in terms of understanding how a society moves towards a better life for everyone. The idea of equal human dignity is a deeply embedded liberal idea. The common humanity goes back to Wilberforce. The free markets, natural liberty go back to Adam Smith. And experience has shown that they work. There is no third way which allows government to design everything and say that it's democratic and meet the desires and wishes of the public. And we're in for a rough period, in my view, looking at that. And so what I hope these books will be is that memory. It's the memory there and it's available so that anyone interested in politics, particularly people in politics, I hope will, during their summer vacations or when they've got some space in their lives, consider what this country is really like, what it's about, and how the ideals of political parties need to be reinforced, and if reinforced, will lead to policy which has already moved us to becoming a nation which recognises equal human dignity and freedom as much as, or I would suggest more than, any other country in the world. Thank you very much.
It's not so much a book launch for me, it's more of a sort of ribbon cutting. When I took this project on, when I took this project on, David sent me the manuscript of his first volume, and I said, this has to be published. It's rather like Australia's roads. Up until quite recently, you'd be driving on virtually a goat track between Sydney and Melbourne. Now I could leave my home in the North Shore of Sydney, 2 or 3 sets of lights and no more sets of lights till I get to Melbourne. It is magnificent. And one day I might even be able to do that to Brisbane too. We need infrastructure, and what David has produced here is a vital piece of intellectual infrastructure for Australia. 5 volumes setting out the history in rather more length than most Australians will have time to read. Although I will say this, David mentioned that we were successful in securing sponsorship for the first 4 volumes, the first one from the Pratt Foundation, the subsequent 3 from the Cormac Foundation, and I thank both of those organisations heartily for getting this program off the ground. Because we couldn't have afforded it on the Menzies Research Centre's budget. But you kindly said some nice words about me, but let's acknowledge the Cormac Foundation, the Pratt Foundation for the work they did for getting this off the ground. So here we have it now, the complete 5-volume set, and we've got a lot more work to do, as David said. We've talked, and we've talked more about the concise 1-volume edition. We'll talk too about turning it into an audio book, because I don't know if you're like me, but I can listen to audio books a lot in the car, and most of my reading is done that way now. So that will be another thing we can do. We initially said, of course, and the reason I was so desperate to get MUP to publish it is because they did the country the disservice of publishing Manning Clark's rather strange and quirky multi-volume history of Australia, which when I first came to this country was the thing everybody told you to read. And even then, as a new Australian, I thought, this doesn't sound quite right. This never felt to me like the fatal shore. It felt to me like a country of redemption, as indeed it is. We had to write the story as we should have been told it in schools, and David, you've done that. You've outclassed Manning Clark in every level. You have, I would say, about 5 million times more footnotes than he did, and that goes to your scholarship. There's just one task left, and some of you may remember, Manning Clark's History of Australia was turned into a musical. So I look forward to launching, to being at the Sydney Opera House for the launch of David Kemp the Opera at some stage. But thank you, David. Thank you very much. And just a few more words of advertising. You can buy, if you're fortunate enough to be here tonight, you can buy the book on the spot, and I'll tell you why that's important that you do that in a moment. Secondly, if you're watching this on the live stream around the country, around the world, you can get the book by going on to the Menzies Centre website, www.menziesrc.org, or just go into your search engine, type Menzies Research Centre. There'll be a big tab at the top called Books. You can go to our bookstore, order it, and we'll get it to you as fast as we can. The very first volume, I have to go right back into this history, David, to find it. Here it is, The Land of Dreams. The lack of faith that MUP had in this, I shouldn't speak ill of your wonderful publishers, but they did ask for a considerable amount of money up front because they didn't think this book was going to sell. Let me tell you, the first book, the first edition of the first volume has been out of stock for a long time. MUP have been coming to us to ask us to drain our stocks of it so they could fill up the bookshops. We have, I think, James will tell me, I think 10 or 12 volumes left. 10 volumes left. The 10 final editions of existing copies of the first edition of this book are on sale tonight. We're not even going to charge you extra for them. You can have them at $60, the same as the rest of them, and a signature from the author on the first volume of what I agree with Daniel Hannan is going to be a remarkable work. It'll sit up there alongside The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire and every other book that you think is sensational. It'll sit up there with Evelyn Waugh's Scoop, my favourite book, but much higher, and alongside, of course, Daniel's book. So do that. A quick plug for our wonderful partners, ADH TV. This is it. This is it streaming live right now. I still get a buzz out of this, by the way. We are streaming live on ADH TV. Congratulations to Jack and everybody at ADH for helping us out with this. This is the way of the future. Much bigger audiences we can reach now with works like this. Thank you to ADH TV. Thank you all for being here. And we look forward to welcoming you again to another Menzies Research Centre event soon. But first of all, just one final round of applause, please, for Daniel Hannan, our very modest author. I will stand up again, to David Kemp. Well done, David. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and good night.